Kia ora, everyone. I hope I said that right. I hate butchering other people's languages. I know how annoying it is when people try and attempt to speak in Arabic and it's completely wrong. But thank you so much for hosting me today. And it's a real pleasure. I never thought in my career that I would end up on the other side of the world delivering to great people like yourselves. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and I hope that you will take something back from what I'm going to share with you today, but I hope that I'll also be taking back a lot of learning from your practice and your experience here in New Zealand as well. So, as was mentioned, I've worked for over a decade in the community and voluntary sector, and this has been predominantly with children and young people, although when I started work it was predominantly with young men. So be it as a youth worker or a community development manager, I was continually dealing with children living in violent homes or adults who were child survivors of domestic abuse who were dealing with their trauma in their adulthood. This is exactly what led me to working for Women's Aid, a national leading domestic abuse charity in the UK, where I'm currently leading the work on children and young people. Although what I'll be talking to you today is some of the work that we're currently doing, but it's also past work. The project that I'm currently delivering in the UK is actually specifically to do with how we support pregnant women and women with very young children, so children under the age of 3. And there is a free resource for that, so if any of you do work with that demographic specifically, then I can send you the toolkit that we have currently for that and the training that accompanies that. So what I wanted to do is to start by introducing the history of how Women's Aid came to be, as I feel it's going to provide you with a bit of context as to the way that we approach the work around domestic violence and the different pieces of work that we've been doing. So today I'll be specifically talking about the Prevention in Work Schools, which is the Safer Futures project. We'll be looking at challenging online behaviours, which was an addition to the toolkit that was created, as well as looking at the children and young people's model that we're currently developing based on what we call Change That Lasts, which is the Women's Aid strategy for domestic violence nationally. So I'll be talking through some of that, although we've only been doing that for about 6 months. So it's very, very new, and as you can imagine, if you're going to develop a strategy, it's going to take a hell of a lot more than 6 months to try to do that. What I will say is that all of our work is very much dependent on survivor voices and our members, which I will explain in the history how that's kind of come about. So I've tried not to overdo the slides today because my coordination skills are really poor. I can't speak and change slides at the same time, so I try to keep them to a minimum. So there isn't a lot of information on there, they're mostly just prompts, so if you would like any more information about anything I do speak about, then just let me know. There is a lot of information that I can send you, but I don't want to bombard you with anything that is not necessarily of interest to you. So do let me know, but I'm happy for the slides to be shared and anything else that you need from me. So Women's Aid, firstly, has anyone heard of Women's Aid prior? Yeah, okay. Well, I know, a Mancunian of all things. I come from Manchester, and this morning I met another fellow Mancunian, which is always nice. Okay, so a number of people here who've already heard of Women's Aid. So that's great. So Women's Aid grew out of the women's liberation movement in the UK and internationally during the 1970s, engaging at the time in what was seen to be radical feminism, radical feminist principles, as it were, which are probably very much less radical nowadays, although it does sometimes make me wonder under the current political turmoil that we have in the UK particularly, and also in the US and various other countries. So the women's liberation movement held numerous conferences, the first taking place in 1970 in Ruskin College in London, and through these conferences women demanded certain rights, which is what the principles of Women's Aid started on. And the core principles of this feminist movement, which has become enshrined in the work of Women's Aid, is the following. So the personal is political, that domestic abuse should not be seen as a private matter, and that it is an integral part of gender politics, women's oppression at home and in the public, is on a continuum, and therefore domestic abuse is a social and political issue that needs to be addressed. So a change in the way that we talk about domestic violence and the opportunities for public bodies, governments, to actually change the way that they support survivors. Also, the other principles are around consciousness raising, so an understanding about how we all fit into a broad socio-political context that impact all of our lives. And as women, that has changed over time, but still a lot of things that still need to be changed. And the idea that sisterhood is powerful, that the women can support one another and be strong together, that collective action is what changes the world, and the importance of women-only spaces, which Women's Aid still maintain in the work that we do. So throughout the 1960s and the 1970s, there were numerous demonstrations, campaigns, women's consciousness raising groups led to the formation of women's centres, which in turn then turned into the idea of refuges. Refuges appeared across the UK and in Europe, run by feminist groups, and the first of which was set up in 1971 in Chiswick in London. And in 1974, National Women's Aid Federation was formed, bringing together 40 of those refugees across the UK, and it became an umbrella body for refuge provision, providing a national identity with common aims and principles about how they all work together. In 1976, rape crisis centres also were formed in London, and they started their own collective, which still functions today, and Women's Aid and rape crisis centres work quite closely together. Back in 1973, it was Women's Aid who first began to use the term domestic abuse when addressing Parliament, which changed the previously used term wife battering. Language became and continues to be an important part of changing and challenging the narratives around violence against women and girls particularly. At this point, Women's Aid subscribed to the 7 feminist principles that the women's movement was fighting for, which was equal pay, equal education and job opportunities, free contraception and abortion, free 24-hour nurseries, legal and financial independence for all women, and freedom from all forms of intimidation by the threat or use of violence or sexual coercion, particularly regardless of your marital status, because at that time, obviously being married really conflicted many people around what was termed, does rape actually exist in marriage? And that needed to be changed, and that's what they were fighting for. Obviously, we haven't achieved all of these things, and there are still battles to be fought, but a great deal has changed over the years. And they operated as a collective calling on changes that would improve the lives of women in the UK. And the services provided were led by groups of survivors and volunteers who ran refuges and supported other women fleeing violence, building their skills to organise effectively, but importantly, ways of empowering one another. To more current history, the National Women's Aid Federation then separated into Women's Aid England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, each existing as separate charities that support independent organisations in their specific countries. So in 1996, Women's Aid Federation of England was formed in Bristol, which is who I work for. So I work across England specifically, although we work with our sister organisations in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland very closely. So the Women's Aid England is a federation of women's organisations that run in England specifically, with nearly 200 independent members that work across the country. Who provide life-saving services to women and children, providing refuge, helplines, play therapies, outreach services, and specialist support services, for example, for black and minoritized women, disabled women, LGBT women, etc. And many also work with male survivors and do some perpetrator work. But you can imagine that as Women's Aid, predominantly most of our work is to support women and their children. So we act as a coordinating body, assisting local members with policy development, being a voice on policy issues nationally, campaigning, research, training, resource development, sustainability of their frontline services, and more. Basically, what our members need, we try and adapt to support them with. And perhaps one of the most important services we offer is the principles in which guide women's aid today and what forms the quality standards we have in place. So the quality standards there's 7 quality standards based on the feminist principles, but specifically for today, number 5 is the one around children and young people, their rights to safety, education and family to be upheld. And each one of these is broken down into outcomes that members must meet to gain the quality mark. Which not only ensures that the Federation members are providing good quality services to women and children, but it's often a useful measure for commissioners and funders. So there's a whole system of how you apply to become quality assured through Women's Aid, and these are the things that you have to show evidence that you are doing within your service in order to gain the quality mark. So there's lots of things, and I can talk more about that if anyone is interested in that, although it's not technically my area of work. I just need to make sure that the members, when working with children, know how to reach those outcomes. As you can imagine, Women's Aid movement has had numerous successes, and we can see this in the following list of achievements of the women's liberation movement and the work of Women's Aid as a collective body fighting for the safety and rights of women and children. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there have been some interesting changes recently, particularly with the introduction of the domestic abuse bill, which is seen as a landmark bill and a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get some things changed that have been impacting survivors. But it's been on a massive roller coaster ride, because if any of you follow any of the politics in the UK, the government has suspended Parliament, or did suspend Parliament, which meant that actually all the work that was based on this bill had to also be suspended. And then the Supreme Court found the government to be unlawful, which meant that actually government had to then go back to Parliament and meet, which thankfully meant the domestic abuse can just carry on. The bill could just carry on to its second reading. And that was done a couple of weeks ago now, with an incredibly emotional speech from a Labour MP called Rosie Duffield, detailing her own personal experience of coercive control and the many faces of abusers, but also of survivors, challenging many of the myths we hear about who and where domestic abuse takes place. And it's well worth watching. It went viral, the video went viral a couple of weeks ago, and it's easily available online if you search her name. So although there's been changes, it comes at a really, politically unstable time. And with any of these changes, for instance, if you look at one of the changes, which I forgot to put on the slide here, is the introduction of the PSHE curriculum, which is the Personal, Social and Health Education curriculum, which is being made compulsory by 2020 by the government. However, absolutely no resources, funding or money has been outlined as to how this work is going to be implemented in schools. So the expectation is that all schools are suddenly going to have to do all this, but no money for anyone to actually deliver it, which is not great. So this is the state of, unfortunately, the way that we seem to be working. Going to the next slide? Yeah. So I wanted to show you this short video campaign that we did specifically around children living with and experiencing domestic violence. I'll just show this and then we can continue.
Do you think they're going to be working late again?
I will adore you if you turn me in right now.
That was part of a campaign, because up until, well, still even now, when we talk about, and I was talking about how language needs to change and shift, we talked about, the idea that actually when we talk about children, we always talk about them as passive to abuse that's happening in their homes. We always talk about children as witnessing domestic violence. We talked about them as being exposed to domestic violence. We rarely talk about children as living with and experiencing that domestic abuse at home. Whether they are directly targeted by the perpetrator or not, actually a lot of research now suggests that the experience of children living in violent homes is pretty identical to children who are directly abused by perpetrators. And so it was an attempt to try and change some of that language and start talking about children as living with domestic violence in their homes and experiencing that domestic violence. And so I'm sure none of these statistics are going to surprise any of you, but I wanted to give you a glimpse on the scale of the issue in the UK and why this work is so important. So as you saw in the video, it's estimated that 160,000 children, although this is a very rough estimate, and actually the numbers are potentially much, much higher. I've seen statistics where it goes up to about 500,000. But Women's Aid, based on kind of their own statistics with their member services, estimated to be about 160,000 children living with domestic abuse in their homes. According to the ONS, it's estimated that 1.3 million women experience domestic abuse. The national leading children's charity estimate that 1 in 5 children live with domestic abuse at home. And in polls around experiences of young girls aged 13 to 17 and young boys, 25% of girls and 18% of boys have said that they've experienced some form of physical violence from an intimate partner. Emotional violence goes up to 75% for girls and about 50% for boys when looking at emotional and psychological violence that's perpetrated in those very young relationships. 61.7% of women in refuge that access our services have children under the age of 18 with them, with children always double the number of women that are accessing those services. So if you can imagine that every woman is coming with at least 2 to 3 children, children always outnumber the number of women that are accessing those services. And yet we don't talk about those children, we just talk about the survivors. And we don't talk about the perpetrator either, which we will continue on, because that's another area of work that we're trying to change. And in the UK, 2 women per week are killed by a partner or an ex-partner. So it doesn't make for great reading, and only last month the news that domestic violence killings have reached a 5-year high in the UK, with 173 people murdered in domestic violence related homicides, an increase of 32 deaths from 2017. The vast majority being women, but I haven't seen a breakdown of it yet. Perhaps no surprise with 10 years of austerity in the UK, which has targeted the community and voluntary sector, and particularly women's services, and cutting local councils' budgets in half, with many local authorities unable to cope with the demands and needs of their communities. It even led to the UN Rapporteur on Poverty, Philip Alston, to highlight concerns in a damning report on the UK, where he says austerity has inflicted misery on UK citizens. Numerous changes to welfare reforms have put financial pressures on women, particularly single mothers, trying to survive after leaving an abusive relationship. Benefit caps, changes to the welfare system, with an introduction to what has been a disastrous universal credit system, and a 2-child tax credit limit disallowing more claiming benefits for more than 2 children. When at least 17.7% of women accessing refuge provision at Women's Aid after leaving an abusive relationship had more than 2 children with them. And although there are exemptions, it is up to women to prove abuse or rape, which in itself is problematic, and furthermore neglects to see each child as an independent citizen with their own rights, who actually can't control whether they are born first or whether they're born third in their families. He also states that British compassion for those who are suffering has been replaced by a punitive, mean-spirited and callous approach. And I think that tells you a lot about the state of the UK currently. So it's within this rather depressing backdrop that our work is stemming from, and particularly my approach to tackling the issue early on, educating people on where to get help, and vitally ensuring that policy and funding is put into the areas to address them. So when I first started at Women's Aid, almost 5 years ago now, I took on the Safer Futures project. This was a prevention-based project utilising a free resource called Expect Respect. Again, it's free to download to anyone, and you can easily find it by Googling Women's Aid Expect Respect. And this was a prevention-based project utilising this toolkit that was created by Women's Aid and educational consultants targeting work on schools with children from the ages of 4 to 18. So this is the front page of the toolkit, and the toolkit is a selection of lesson plans. It's basically for schools to be able to open up the toolkit and find a full lesson plan that they can deliver in schools. They're age appropriate with activities that would cover one lesson time, and these lesson plans aim to do some of the following. So changing beliefs and attitudes about men and women, challenging assumptions about gender and power, managing feelings and accepting responsibility for one's own feeling and behaviours, helping to resolve conflict, knowing the difference between abusive and non-abusive relationships, the consistent message that abuse is not okay, understanding that abuse is a crime, highlighting the role of peers in providing support, and giving information about where to get help, which is an important, for any school, that is probably the most important thing, because many of them get really scared about having to deliver these kinds of sessions because of potential disclosures and where they will be seeking support. So the format of each lesson is about 40 minutes to 1 hour long. So one lesson time in the UK is about 45 minutes. I don't know whether it's different here. But most of the lessons actually can be put into more than one lesson because they are quite intense, some of them. But they are meant to be active, fun, they're challenging, they have warm-up activities, a main lesson plan, and some additional work for any child who finishes quickly or early or needs some additional support. They work as standalone lessons with groups of children and young people, although I've known many professionals who utilise the resources for one-to-one work and have creative ways to use the messages and the activities in the toolkit for other settings. So I've used it in youth clubs because that's my background, and I've trained social workers, for instance, to use it in their work also. So it's quite versatile, and I've seen many professionals take what they need from it in order to address some of the challenges that they have when working with children and young people. So the aim of the project was to provide our member services or specialist domestic abuse services an understanding on how to use the toolkit through a training program that ran across England. So I think we had about 40 odd training sessions across England itself to different services at that point. And it offered professionals the ability to become Women's Aid schools advocates who were champions in their local schools. It was also to help teachers to deliver lessons about domestic abuse by building their own understanding on the impact that it has on children and young people that they may be working with. We encourage schools to link to their local member services where there is a schools advocate in order to support schools with any disclosures. And our aim was to connect with local and national domestic abuse services to create a more coordinated approach in supporting schools in delivering prevention work, and many services used the toolkit and created other resources and training to fill some of the gaps, such as a really great example of an organisation called Safeguarding Essentials, which was working with nurseries. So they were given some particular funding to work with about 30 different nurseries across the Northwest, and so they wanted to adapt it to that preschool age children. The toolkit does provide a lot of preliminary reading to build knowledge of the importance of prevention work and why it's needed to tackle domestic abuse. However, it's an incredibly sensitive subject that you can imagine. I'm sure any of you that have worked in schools in the UK, the moment you mention domestic violence, everyone runs for the hills in schools and pretends that actually they don't have a problem and these things don't exist in their schools, which I've heard many times when I've delivered training specifically because they've had some serious issues and serious cases where domestic abuse was definitely an issue, and on 2 instances in 2 different schools where the mother was murdered by the perpetrator, and they were having to then deal with the trauma that that child was experiencing at that point. And it never occurred to any of them, even though there was numerous signs throughout that this child needed support, and so did their mother. The school didn't do anything. So it's about making sure that we are supporting schools as early as possible so that they don't end up in that situation of having to deal with the trauma of a child who's just lost their mum. So this was, so that there was a lot of challenges in the schools program, and the connection between the schools advocates and the schools really supported that, because schools then felt much more comfortable to allow a professional to come in and deliver that work rather than try and attempt to train the teachers to deliver that work, which was fine with us. Unfortunately, this wasn't very well funded by local authorities or the government, and those workers were often working part-time and incredibly stretched to try and deliver to the schools that were in their local vicinity. So this particular organisation that was working with nursery created additional training for nursery teachers and began to break down each lesson plan further to look at how to implement the toolkit in that particular setting. All this was with the aim that children and young people will understand healthy relationships, their rights and responsibilities in a relationship, as well as using schools as a captive audience to raise awareness on domestic abuse and embed it into their local communities. One of the things that I would do is I used to go into schools and look at things that they could do differently in terms of the way that the school looked and how inviting it was for women who were potentially looking for some sort of support, who were picking up their children or going home with their children, coffee mornings, just having numbers of people that they can contact, particularly local domestic violence services, but also the police representative who was particularly dealing with that issue in their local area. So providing just a space for women to be able to say, well, actually, I just need a phone to be able to ring somebody safely in order to get that support helped a lot. And many schools weren't even offering the basics, unfortunately, to make it an inviting space for women to seek support. One of the things that we were unfortunately unsuccessful with at the time was lobbying and campaigning to make PSHE, personal, social and health education, compulsory in schools, which was part of what the project aim was. And in the UK, teaching about issues like domestic abuse and healthy relationships is not mandatory, even though every school is dealing with these cases daily. And so it's up to the school discretion how it is taught, if it's even taught, and then it's mostly ad hoc rather than embedded into the school and their policies. What Expect Respect was trying to do was frame it so that it worked easily with the schools and made it as simple as possible for schools to implement this work. Luckily, as I mentioned, the government has made a commitment to make PSHE compulsory, which includes within it relationship and sex education, which you can imagine has created a whole host of other issues that I'm dealing with at the moment, not within my role at Women's Aid, but actually as a local counsellor in the local schools that I represent, who have been on the news because parents are not happy about the fact that their children are being forced to have sex and relationship education classes. So not only do you have the schools having an issue, you also then end up with parents having an issue around what is taught and how it's taught. And unfortunately, parents have a lot of misinformation fed through around, somebody said to me, why are you teaching my child to have sex at the age of 5? It's like, that's not what we do. That's not what it's about. And in primary school, it's not compulsory to teach sex education anyway. What is compulsory is relationship education, which covers a whole host of things, such as different types of families, which is also a contentious issue, particularly in religious communities, which is why I've been brought in to work with families around understanding the Equalities Act and the reason why those issues need to be addressed in the school setting. So there's a lot of problems, but it is being made compulsory by 2020 for all schools to have a PSHE curriculum. But like I mentioned, there is no money to back any of this up. So it does worry me around how schools are going to manage this and how well they're going to be able to do this without the right support and funding, particularly for specialist services to be able to support schools in doing that work. So although I welcome the changes, it comes with a lot of questions and hesitation about it. To show the toolkit activities, I'm going to do a quick activity with you that I always find young people love and adults too, but I've had some really worrying responses from many adults, which we try and challenge in sessions where I've delivered this work, but hopefully it's a really fun activity. And the point of a lot of the activities, particularly for the older years, which is high school and above, is to really engage in conversation and listen to what young people have to say. And then we can understand where there's things that we need to be challenging or asking a bit more about, and where there's gaps where we need to be offering that support. So this is an activity for year 10. Year 10 in the UK are 14-ish, 13, 14, something like that, age group. No, they're 14, 15. So they're slightly older, so they're just nearly, this is when they're going into their GCSE years, which is the last 2 years of high school in the UK. This is called Behaviours, Okay or Not. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read some of these statements, and what I want you to do is either, I've written this somewhere so I don't forget. Okay, so if you think that the behaviour is okay, then stand up. If you think the behaviour is not okay, then stay seated. If you're unsure, then just put your hand up, just wave it, okay? Okay, so if you think it's okay, stand up. If you think it's not okay, stay seated. If you're unsure, wave your hands at me, okay? So let's start with a relatively easy one. So putting me down in public, especially in public. Is that okay, not okay, or you're unsure? Okay. Yeah, don't worry, not okay is sitting down, so you're all doing okay. I should have put these instructions on the board. Okay, so relatively easy, yeah, not okay. Generally, some of the young people will have a conversation about why that is not okay, but generally speaking, most will agree that that is not an okay behaviour. Okay, helping me to choose clothes when we go out. Helping me to choose clothes when we go out. Okay, a lot of hand waving. Okay, why the hand waving? Who would like to share why they're waving their hands?
I think it depends on the context.
Yeah. Yep.
If I'm going to a partner's family event and it's a particular culture, then it may be appropriate to have some guidance that actually a funeral in our family, we need to wear something a bit different.
Yeah.
But then I can see where that can be very dangerous in that it's a form of control and designed to, not be so obvious.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So the point, all of these are quite ambiguous, most of them anyway. The whole point is to say, yeah, actually, that sometimes there is a reason why this might happen, but there are other reasons which can be abusive or controlling. So yeah, you're right. Yeah, there are some situations where it's nice to have somebody, to tell you, direct you in what you should or shouldn't be wearing in a particular cultural setting or whatever, but that it's also can be used as a way to control and abuse somebody. Okay, thank you. Okay, the next one is turning up to surprise me. Ooh. You can tell you all work in this area because when you do this with young people, they're all standing up and saying, yeah, this is great. Okay, so why are we waving our hands this time? Yeah?
I think it's the intention behind it.
Yeah.
What's his or her intention to turn up and surprise you?
Yeah. So is there a particular reason why they're surprising you, or are they just checking up on you? Is that balance of, what is it that they're trying to do? A lot of young people think it's really sweet and really nice, and being surprised all the time is amazing, and we shouldn't take that away from young people. And I always, when I do this, because I always train professionals who work in this particular area, it's always doom and gloom, and I always have to say, actually, young love is great, and there's always going to be ups and downs in relationships. relationships, and we shouldn't be taking away the nice things that young people will, undoubtedly have in those relationships that we might think, ooh, trigger, actually is just a really nice thing for them. Let's go on.
How do I identify that though?
Well, in the conversations, you will start to identify it. And the point of this toolkit isn't to put things into young people's minds. It is about having that conversation and challenging what they have to say. I've never done this with a group of young people where we haven't had a balance of opinions. So even for that one, some of them will say, but is he checking up on me, miss? Is he doing this, miss? So you'll always have that balance. Young people are incredibly intuitive to all of these things, but they never have the space with anyone to actually have these conversations. And I think that's what all we're providing, is that space. And when you hear something that's a little bit off, or you think that something might be a bit wrong here, either you decide to challenge it in that session, or you can have that conversation privately, depending on what's best in that context that you're working in. So it's never about us trying to tell young people how they should or shouldn't be behaving, or it's about just making sure that they're opening those conversations. And if they're not saying these things, then asking the right questions to try and draw that out, because you will be amazed. The types of conversations that I've had with young people are shocking, their experiences, particularly at this age, of what they experience in their early relationships, and sometimes not even in relationships, just things that they experience in their school setting. So it is just inviting conversation and discussion. Okay, so let's do this last one. Expecting me to wait in for calls. Not okay? Not even like a waving? No? Okay. Why is that not okay, definitely?
Because it's a controlling thing.
It sounds like it's a controlling thing, yeah? Why?
You stay home until I decide that...
Yeah, that I'm calling you. Yeah, no time, no context given. I did once do this with a youth conference, and one girl said to me, I do this because she has a boyfriend in the US, and so there is an expectation that they wait in for calls because of the time difference. So that's the first time where I've heard, somebody say, oh, actually, you know what, this is what we do because this is how we communicate. This is the only way that we can communicate, and he left this year and I really miss him. And it was like, oh, okay, so this is interesting information for me, because actually, sometimes we think that it's a no-no, and actually there are certain situations that young people are drawing in on their own experiences that we need to be reflective of. So, yeah, but generally speaking, yeah, we've got mobiles. There is no need for anyone to sit at home and waiting for calls anyway. But yeah, so you can see how this is really just an activity to get those conversations going and engage young people and really listen to what young people have to say. The number of times I've delivered this with teenagers, and they always say to me it's the first time that anyone's actually asked them about things that they were experiencing in their relationships, and that somebody actually listened and not butted in every 2 minutes about what they thought, and just allowed the conversation to flow. And it does. You'd be surprised at how easily it flows in that classroom of young people. I do find that it's easier to do it in gender separated groups. Where I've done it in mixed groups, boys tend to take over, and always ends up slightly changing the conversation a little bit. And I think sometimes, particularly young boys tend to try and test the waters. And I think when they see me, they think that I'm easily intimidated because there's a certain perception about Muslim women, I think, in the UK and perhaps here as well, where I was once in an assembly and a boy was asking me, but miss, we're about pornography. And I thought, okay, well, let's explore that. And he wasn't expecting us to be exploring pornography, but we did in that lesson. And he came up with a really great answer as to why, we need to talk about pornography, because it was impacting the way that boys saw women and girls, and we had a really interesting conversation. So even though he was trying to be to ruin the conversation in some ways and redirect it, actually what it started was a really good conversation about the impact of pornography on children and young people's lives. So I always find that it's easier for girls to speak in separated groups. They are much more open and they have more opportunity to actually share their experiences. But I think a mixture of the two sometimes is nice. I've yet to deliver it to a group of just boys, because you never get invited to talk about these things to boys. which I always find amazing because most of my work experience has been with young adult boys, between the ages of 16 to 24. And actually those conversations are much needed in that setting as well, but schools tend to pick the girls to have those conversations and not the boys, and I think that's really worrying and something that needs to be challenged as well. Okay, thank you for participating in that. I hope you can see kind of how the activities run. All the activities are really different, and you can choose. I mean, it tells you how to run them in a lesson, but I always find that it's sometimes more interesting to kind of change them up a little bit and get people moving around rather than just sitting and cutting. There's a lot of cutting and pasting and things like that, which I think is just boring, but whatever works in the setting. So as part of the work on Expect Respect, the biggest gap that began emerging was around online issues, as you can imagine. So schools already do a significant amount of work on internet safety, but actually talking to young people, including my own kids, who I'm sure for those of you with children do all my security settings. They show me what I'm doing wrong online and understand perfectly how to stay safe. Yet many choose not to follow those rules themselves. So why? And that was the question that I was trying to answer. This is what I wanted to explore by giving power to children and young people to educate us, educate me, what were they using, why they behaved in the way they did online, and the different forms of social media and spaces they occupied, what behaviours worried them, what their experiences were, and also address what they loved about being online, because there are positives, and I think we should always remember that. So over the last decade, so if you were, I grew up in the 90s, and the first time I had an internet was when I was about 13 or 14, which was much sooner than most of my friends, and that was only because my dad was a computer engineer, and so we ended up with a really slow connected AOL, if any of you are familiar with that. And nowadays, that picture is very much different and has changed drastically. So we can see that over the last decade or so, the usage of the internet has skyrocketed amongst adults as well as young people and children, and it has become easier, faster, and more accessible to have internet and internet services everywhere that we go. With the massive changes in pace of the internet and how we all connect, has meant that many negative behaviours become a norm in online spaces, but it's also a part of our everyday lives and creates many opportunities for most of us. So I'm going to do another short activity with you. So if you could all take out your phones, if you haven't already. And I want you to open up your phone and look at how many apps you use that you communicate with other people. So where you communicate, such as email or Facebook or WhatsApp, but also where you share information like a blog or something similar, and also where there is a possibility to contact somebody, though that's not necessarily why that particular app is there, such as Airbnb when booking places, so you're connecting with other people, although that's not necessarily, it's not necessarily a messaging service for that. So I want you to just do your maths, count how many apps that you have, either on your phone or a tablet or whatever you use at home, and just have a rough number of how many you are using. I can see some of you ticking a lot of pages. See? Has everyone got a rough number? Okay, so let's see how many. So who has less than 5? Okay, less than 5. Okay, might challenge that a little bit, but we'll see. Okay, who has between 5 and 10? Okay, more than 10? More than 15? Yeah? Okay, there's still a few. There's no shame in that. I've got loads of apps on my phone that I use for all sorts of things. Okay, generally when I'm doing the work on online behaviours with professionals, I get a lot of people who say to me, oh, we don't use this, we don't like any of this, we don't understand it, and then actually when they get their phones out, the amount of apps that they are actually using and using to make their lives easier, but also using to connect with family, friends, learning about things, even where they don't post. So for instance, people who don't necessarily post, but, go on to blogs to read articles, etc. All of those things are ways that we are interacting with information and other people within the internet. And I think it's really important to understand how we're utilising these apps and spaces, because our behaviour on those spaces is also very different. How we use Facebook is very different to how we might blog, to how we might email, to how we might use Snapchat or Instagram, and all of those things are really important for us to understand first, before then we start to engage with young people. And young people will have very different experiences of whichever app that they use. So for instance, in the UK, Snapchat is the big thing. It has been for a number of years now, and predominantly the reason young people use it is because you can send a message and 24 hours later it's gone. And when you're messaging people, it goes instantly unless you save a message. So there's lots of different reasons why they enjoy using certain apps, and we need to understand why that is, so that one, we can develop our services based on that information, but also so we understand why they behave in certain ways where they feel they've got more anonymity than in other places. So really important to kind of just address our own experiences online first before we talk to children and young people about them. So at Women's Aid, we recognise the correlation of abusive relationships that young people can experience, which can often have an online element. And in a Women's Aid survey in 2015, it was found that 85% sorry, I've lost my track. 85% of respondents said that the abuse they received online from a partner or an ex-partner was part of a pattern of abuse that they also experienced offline. So the correlation between how abuse exists online and offline is very clear, because for many young people particularly, there is no switching off from it, or that's what it feels like. And I wanted to share a story from one of our youth ambassadors who supported this training and now actually works for Women's Aid, called Chloe. So I'm going to read this story in her own words as she wrote it in the first person. Okay? So Chloe writes, I met my ex-boyfriend when I was 13, and we were both fans of the same TV show, and we got talking about that on Twitter. So he was 3 years older than me and always talking to me about and giving me compliments, and my real life was much more difficult, and my ex seemed like the only person who actually cared and was on my side. We became boyfriend and girlfriend online, and he was always saying how much he loved me and that we were going to get married and be together always. So far, yeah, great relationship, supposedly. About 6 months after we began talking online, I was taken into hospital as an inpatient completely against my will. Chloe was suffering from anorexia and still deals with that now. And so she was taken in against her will. I was very homesick and I couldn't have any internet access or phone him. So I broke up with him, which I didn't think was a big deal because we'd never actually met face to face. He was absolutely furious. He said I'd ruined his entire life, and he started calling me names and swearing at me on text. Looking back, I can say that's probably when I should have forgotten him altogether. But I'd been bullied by boys who said the same kinds of things to me, so it didn't strike me as a big deal. I got more leave from hospital and he calmed down. We became friends again and arranged to meet face to face for the first time. My mum was there the first time we met, and he was very shy and tentative. And after that, he would often come and stay with us for the weekend, and I went to stay with him in Birmingham, which is about a couple of hours from where she was living at the time. He seemed like the perfect boyfriend, very charming, always bringing presents and doing little things for me. In between visits, he started to change. He'd lose his temper and scream at me, or go on about how ugly girls looked if they didn't dress in a revealing way, then call me a slut or a whore for following his instructions. He started self-harming and said it was my fault for making him unhappy. Every argument went back to how I'd broken up with him in 2011. He said after that I'd changed into a bad person and he could never love me quite as much again. He stashed over 50 boxes of paracetamol ready to take an overdose, and he'd show them to me, but say if I told anyone, he'd do it straight away. I would stay up all night whilst he repeatedly hung up the phone saying he was on the edge of a building ready to jump and then not pick up for hours. I was too exhausted to go to school, and he said that there was no point anyway because I was too stupid. I told him I wanted to go to university, and he lost his temper saying he couldn't believe I would do that instead of spending my time with him. I think from my perspective, I felt like I just had to be a good girlfriend to him, and I thought I was responsible for keeping him safe. My ex formally broke up with me in September 2012, but nothing really changed because we had an agreement not to see other people. He watched every single thing I did online. If I even put an X on the end of a message to a boy, I was a dirty slag and obviously wanted to have sex with him. I said he was hypocritical because he always flirted with girls online, and he said I was insecure and would have to be cured if we were ever to get back together. He'd make up rules to cure my insecurity, like I wasn't allowed to contact him for 2 weeks, and if I did, extra days would be added on, but of course he always broke it first. Yeah. And in March 2013, I was meeting him in Birmingham, and I got to the train station early. I sat in a coffee shop waiting for him, and he sent texts saying he knew I was having sex in the public toilets. It was really strange because he knew I'd never done that with him, let alone anyone else. I sent a photo of my coffee mug on the table, but he still wouldn't believe me. We met and he grabbed my hand, waving it in the air, shouting to everyone to look at me because I was a slag and a whore. And he told me that him and his friends would find her and stab her in the face. By the end of the day, he decided he was in love with me again. I was so relieved, I thought I talked him down, I just went along with it. But I think what it shows is that people will find any excuse to get angry, even a totally fabricated one, and then when they calm down, you feel like you've done something right, so you keep trying in the hope that you'll get it right for good. Things just got worse and worse after that point in Birmingham, and not long after that I called the police for the first time, and the officers who came to me were very helpful, but the report didn't go any further. But they told me that what he was doing was a crime. So my ex knew I'd spoken to the police, and they didn't do anything. So after that, he just carried on finding new ways to control me and make me feel like I deserved everything I was getting. He called me fat and started making awful comments about my weight, despite knowing how close I was to going back to hospital. Then he used Ask FM. Are any of you familiar with Ask FM? Yeah, I don't know whether it's that popular now, but it used to be at the time, a few years ago. It's a website that allows you to send and receive anonymous messages. I'd started cutting with razors, copying what he'd done, and he sent streams of messages taunting me for not self-harming properly enough. And one night when he knew I was on my own, he sent messages from the afternoon to the early hours of the morning, telling me the world would be a better place if I were dead, do everyone a favour, slit my throat or drink bleach. A few days later, my account was hacked and everything got deleted. I called the police again after that, but they weren't as helpful as the first officers I'd seen. I had a hard time convincing them that the solution wasn't just to delete my Ask FM account. I think we often get told just to come off social media or ignore it because it's not the real world. But that's not an answer. Why should you have to shut yourself off? The onus should be on the other person to stop being abusive. And just because it's online, it doesn't mean that it's not real or frightening. The police did eventually arrest him for harassment, and there was an investigation for 6 months. It's obviously not all easy. Once someone is arrested, I felt guilty, like I'd let him down, and he broke his bail conditions and kept making threats to try and make me drop the charges. But I think it was the right thing to do because at that point he'd started talking to younger girls online as well. I was really lucky in the end because he pleaded guilty and the judge gave him quite a strict sentence. He got a suspended prison sentence, electronic tagging and a curfew, so he couldn't leave his house between 5 a.m. and 5 p.m. for 2 months. He paid me compensation and has a restraining order not to contact me for 5 years. When we started working on this, his 5 years was nearly up, and she was really stressed about actually what she needed to do next about this. But luckily, she's moved on massively since that relationship. But this is a 13-year-old girl This is an enormous amount of stress to have to deal with, especially on a first relationship, for somebody who's aged 13 and 14 within that time period when she had that relationship. And one of the things that she always used to say to me when we used to deliver the training is that people don't take young people's relationships seriously. They think that it's just a one-off, that they'll get over it, that they'll just move on, as if it's not important, when actually in reality their relationships are just as important as any adult relationship. And we need to be taking seriously what their experiences are and making sure that we support them through whatever they're going through. What we'll go through now is some of the things that were found out in terms of what worries children online, and many of these things you'll see that Chloe has experienced. So the leading charity, NSPCC, did some research to find out the negative online behaviours that young people felt were the most important, and these are the 8 that they found. So you can see, threatening behaviour, trolling, blackmail, cyberbullying, and particularly revenge pornography being a really big issue. I have to go into schools and tell them that a lot of child pornography that exists around the world, and from the UK particularly, is all self-generated. It's children taking pictures and posting them, and then that being shared widely. So it's no longer that you have this paedophile who's taking the images. It's actually children generating those images themselves and where they end up. So it's a really difficult conversation to have with children and young people, because actually how easily things spread across the internet is worrying. So we have cyberbullying, grooming online, fake profiles, hacking accounts, and tagging photos with defamatory or negative comments. So you can see a number of those that Chloe herself experienced. And many of these don't have really strict laws attached to them. Fraud does, because it's business related, but somebody setting up a fake account with your name, although it's illegal, it's very hard to try and prove, and you'd be probably laughed at if you tried to take that to a police station, unless there was some serious things going on with that fake profile. So there are, although there's lots of different laws, particularly in the UK, that relate to some of these things, many of them are just ineffective, and they're actually not connected. And I think there's a lot that we need to be doing in order to make sure that the laws are protecting children and young people, and adults as well, because this isn't just something that happens to young people, it happens to us as well. However, which is I always like to, when I'm doing any work, I don't like the doom and gloom, and we always need to look at, some of the positives. And although online spaces can be negative, as we've seen, they can also be a space for support and positive action. In a survey by Safer Internet, 3 in 4 young people believe they have the power to create kinder communities online, and many young people saw social media as a positive way to build strong friendships. It's important not to make young people feel that they should leave certain online spaces because of negative behaviours that might be displayed, but instead empowering them to understand how to deal with them and get the right support when it becomes abusive. I really loved this particular research when I was looking at this particular area about shaping our image of online spaces and young people within them. So it's talking about young people as social participants and active citizens, content creators, managers, distributors, collaborators and team players, explorers and learners, independent and building resilience and developing key and real-world skills. Because really, that's what young people are doing online most of the time. Not all of it is, negative things that they're engaging in or other people are engaging in against them. So it's important to provide examples of how the use of social media can be positive and a space for change for young people. Online campaigns are designed and run regularly on social networking sites to inform, educate and make change, and young people are often the driving force behind this. And Chloe certainly was the driving force behind many of the different campaigns that we had, and she is one of the core group that is involved in the project that I'm going to share with you now. So at Women's Aid, the launch of the Love Don't Feel Bad, which has recently been rebranded as Love Respect, to teach young people about healthy relationships, healthy behaviours in intimate relationships, and a particular focus on understanding coercive control was aimed at Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat users in order to reach its target audience, because effectively we want to reach young people. There is no point in our work if we're not able to engage young people in the spaces that they use. So Love Respect is a website that was created by the support of our young survivors to provide answers to questions relating to relationships, addressing what makes a healthy relationship and what isn't healthy, providing the confidence for young women to speak out about abuse. The website is currently in beta version. I'm not sure what that means, but I don't think it's finished. But the aim is to provide a frontline advice service that young women can instant message a professional to talk through any concerns they have and seek guidance and support. When they were looking at this particular project, they went to numerous schools and organisations that specifically worked with young women to try and understand how best they wanted to get support. And many of them felt they felt much safer if they were able to just text somebody a question about something that they're worried about and receive an answer, rather than try and phone somebody, because Women's Aid is known to have a national helpline, but it's aimed at 18 plus, and so this is a different approach to what we've usually done in terms of our frontline helpline services. But it's still being developed at the moment. So it is supported by our ambassador, who's a young adult fiction writer, Holly Bourne, who's releasing her new book called The Places I've Cried in Public, which I think is coming out at the end of this month, because when I'm back in the UK, I'm going to be interviewing her in Manchester at a bookstore, I think, for the release of her new book. This book shares the story of Emily, who goes on a journey of memories of all the places her boyfriend Reese made her cry, to begin to understand that love shouldn't feel this bad, and seeks to help to get over her relationship with him, which is a really abusive relationship. And here's a video that was created by Holly Bourne for the Love Respect website that we hope will work.
What's the author of that book?
Holly Bourne is the author of the book. So it's called The Places I've Cried in Public. So Holly Bourne is the woman that's going to be speaking now.
Amna talks about the red flags that she ignored at the beginning of her relationship with Reese. These are sorts of warning signs that kind of indicate that the relationship was a controlling one rather than a loving one. Here are 7 common red flags that you should know about, so you can look out for yourself as well as for your friends. So Reese isolates Amna from her friends sort of slowly and deliberately until she ends up with no friends at all. This makes Amna rely on Reese, which is exactly what he needs in order to control her. Later, he uses his power to make her feel needy and insecure and like nobody loves her. So cheating isn't okay, but being constantly accused of cheating when you're just talking to somebody isn't okay. It's exhausting, and it's another tactic to just control and isolate you, make you nervous, and just have the abusers keep you all to themselves. In my book, Reese is charming and perfect and attentive at the beginning of the relationship, but over time, Amna notices him change. He sometimes ignores her, even when she's there, right there, and that leads her to question what she's done to upset him. The answer is nothing. And then when he's upset, she continually starts pandering to him to try and win back that perfect, wonderful boyfriend that she had at the beginning, who sort of disappeared. Reese is always putting Amna down in front of her friends and then saying, it's just a joke and you're crazy, when she dares to get upset. But publicly humiliating somebody you love isn't really love. Constantly making someone feel insecure or needy or like they're always in the wrong is a way of controlling that person. When you believe you can't get anything right, when you start to lose all of your self-confidence. Then you might say, well, if you've got nothing to hide, then what's the problem? But you're entitled to your privacy, and they should respect that and trust you. Amna is constantly trying to please Reese to make sure she doesn't upset him and to try and keep the Reese that she had at the beginning of her relationship. But constantly tiptoeing around somebody for fear of an emotional punishment isn't okay, it's not a healthy sign. The way that Reese and other abusive people act is not loving, it's controlling.
Okay, so you can see, there's quite a bit of content on the website at the minute. I think it's loverespect.co.uk is the website. So there's already some formulated question answer based on what young people, particularly our young ambassadors, have shared with us as being important questions that a lot of young women ask. It also has some stories, so you will see parts of Chloe's story in there, but other young survivors also sharing their story, and then it's got these kind of, the red flags of what an abusive relationship looks like, etc. So there is quite a bit of content on there, but the aim of the website is really to be a space for young women and young girls particularly to come and seek professional support and advice from someone. So this is the last thing that I'll be talking about, which is the development of the strategy. So Women's Aid has been working with survivors of domestic abuse for over 40 years, and we know that the current system for responding to domestic abuse is not working for most survivors. And frankly, I always say that if this was a business, we would have failed and gone bankrupt a hell of a long time ago, because actually we've seen no changes to the way, to the prevalence of domestic violence in the UK particularly, and therefore obviously something isn't working. So why aren't we looking for different ways of doing things? So this is Women's Aid's attempt to actually look at what we need to be doing differently. At the moment in the UK, what we work with is a risk-based model, which is basically the women who are deemed to be at highest risk get support, children who are deemed to be really high risk get support, and everyone else who falls underneath that gets very little, basically. So there is really very little emphasis on prevention work. There are small pockets of where that happens, but not kind of at a national level. So Women's Aid's attempt of Change That Lasts is actually a trauma-led, a trauma-informed, needs-led type approach. So it's based around listening to what women need from professionals, actually listening and taking that on board. It's the understanding that survivors know what it is that they can and can't do at a particular time in the relationship, and when is a dangerous time and when isn't a dangerous time. And that's what we're working with, is changing that narrative around how we work with survivors. Unfortunately, we have a lot of practice which is very victim blaming, that puts a great onus on mothers to do numerous amounts of things to prove that she's an amazing parent, even though she's dealing with trauma herself, and very little around the perpetrator, actually almost zero interest in what the perpetrator does in that setting. So Change That Lasts is Women's Aid plan for a future where all survivors get the right response to domestic abuse the very first time they seek that support. Change That Lasts changes the way that we think about domestic abuse by focusing on what a survivor needs, not just what the risks are. Her needs will include her safety, but so much more, including housing, mental health, parenting, benefits, and employment. It will give her the support she needs to recover and move on from what she has been through. Change That Lasts works by training people in their communities to know how to start conversations with survivors and put them in contact with the best possible people to help them. Local domestic abuse organisations are at the heart of Change That Lasts, creating systems that work best for survivors. And this Change That Lasts system isn't new. This is actually the way that the women's sector has worked for a long time. But because of funding and commissioning restrictions, have always had to shift in order to meet the demands and needs and expectations of who's funding them. But actually, what we're doing is very much based on the history and the principles of what the feminist movement started up as, which is women supporting other women and making sure that we're listening and supporting survivors. So there are, the Change That Lasts model is being piloted for women, and there is a perpetrator response as well, and each is split up into 3 key areas. And these key areas is Ask Me, which is a community response, Trusted Professional, which is training for professionals who are working with women at different stages, women or children. So that could be police, teachers, etc. So those people that have direct contact with a woman at some point, GPs, etc., barristers as well, in family courts and so forth. And then Voices, which is dedicated to supporting specialist domestic abuse organisations. So these are the 3 areas, and I can send you more detail. There's a lot more detail online. I don't work on this particular model yet because I've just started the development stage for the children's part of where this model might fit into the existing models that are being piloted. For a short period of 6 months, we were tasked, or I was tasked, with putting together a rough framework for what a Change That Lasts children's model could look like. And this entailed a lot of reading, research, meetings with external and internal stakeholders, steering group meetings, internal meetings, scoping resources within the organisation, delivering consultations and workshops at national conferences, and contacting members directly who deliver child-specific and family-specific work. And through that, we were able to begin to put together a rough template, firstly defining the scope of the strategy, which we summarise as the following. So I wanted to make sure that we weren't just going off in a tangent when looking at what the strategy is going to be really focused on. And we are a domestic abuse national service, and we wanted to make sure that that was the core of what we were presenting as the strategy. And so the scope is children and young people living with and experiencing domestic abuse at home or within their peer-to-peer relationships, including abuse that's perpetrated against children and young people as part of the domestic abuse that is experienced at home. So the strapline, which still needs a lot of comms work, is growing up violence-free, but as I said, we're still very early stages. Oops, sorry. I wanted to just highlight this, which is this is an infographic that the Change That Lasts group that are working particularly on women share, because this shows you kind of the journey of one survivor. And actually, if you have a needs-led approach that looks and tackles the trauma that she's experienced, but also tackles the issues as soon as she starts to engage with services, the amount of money that actually is saved long-term and the amount of trauma that is saved on the parent, the woman and her children. So you can see, so the pink line shows what could have happened if we have a needs-led intervention in place, and this kind of greenish looking line is what did actually happen. So this is a real response to a real case, and all of the different services that you can see she's had to go through in order to get any support, which is not really how we want to be dealing with things. So this is kind of the, look, government, give us some money and we'll save you some money, because actually you need a better response to the way that you deal with this issue. And I can send you this, and I think there's another one as well that's quite similar, but a different case study about what could have been done differently for that woman and her children in order to get a different response. So while I was working on the strategy, I was reading the book called Headscarves and Hymens by Egyptian feminist called Munna al-Tahawi. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her. I don't know how popular she is in New Zealand. But it's an incredibly emotional read, and it's got a chapter within it called Home. And we all know that often the most dangerous place for women and children is home, and within this chapter, a quote from it really summed up for me what this was all about. Knowing that home is where the hurt is taking place, and understanding that's where we need to be healing. For far too many children and young people, the fear of domestic violence, whether perpetrated against them or directed towards their mother, is a daily concern. And as part of this strategy, we want to reiterate the importance of the following: the recognition of the trauma that children and young people face living in violent homes, moving away from the assumption that very young children don't know what is going on and that it won't impact them, supporting the relationship between children and their mothers and taking into account the mother's own trauma and some of the difficulties that she might have in parenting, understanding the conflict that children experience when the father is the perpetrator and the relationship that they have with them, the importance of early intervention, taking on an intersectional and gendered approach, and centering children's voices in our work. So I'm not going to talk through all of them, but I wanted to highlight a few that might engage us in some discussion. So as we started thinking about the core values of the strategy, we wanted to ensure that we were beginning by looking at the needs of the most marginalised groups of children and young people. First, to be able to ensure that sorry, my time is... I will be finished shortly. We'll be able to ensure that the development of the strategy was inclusive for everyone. So children and young people have complex and intersecting identities, be it race, faith, disability, or sexual orientation. All plays a critical role in the way that children and young people see themselves, the abuse that they may experience, the way they will access services, their experiences with statutory bodies, and discrimination they or their parents or carers might experience throughout their interactions with services. All have a massive and profound impact on what kind of support they get. And we can't forget that children and young people live in hyper-informed and hyper-gendered contexts in their everyday lives that are full of information and images 24/7 through various mobile devices. And we understand the difficulties and challenges that are often against intersectional gendered approaches in a mainstream climate, particularly in the UK, where actually we lump everyone into a one-size-fits-all model of working. We've moved away from a lot of specialist support because the government just likes the neutral, let's make sure that everyone gets the same service and ignore actually that sometimes different people need different types of services and support. However, we feel that it is necessary so that we don't do a disservice to the experiences of our children. We seek to address the differences of experiences, not looking at hierarchies of abuse. And I also want to address one of the most important parts of the conversation, which is the non-abusive parent. One of the biggest reasons women often stay or leave an abusive relationship is linked to her children. We know that abusers target women's confidence to be mothers, breaking down the relationship she has with her children and using children to maintain control and contact, even when they are separated, as a continuum of the violence they perpetrate. We recognise the importance of working with mothers alongside their children as part of the healing process to overcome the impact of domestic abuse, and children are often dependent and closely connected to their mothers, which is why we need to think about joining up the support that we offer mothers and children. As well as this, it's important not to forget the perpetrator. Essentially, they are the problem. But it has become common practice to focus heavily on the mother as a survivor to prove herself as a parent and victim blame by finding fault in her behaviour, whilst very limited attention is afforded to the perpetrator because they're often deemed too difficult to work with. For children, their complexity of their relationship with both the survivor and the perpetrating adult is difficult to manage. According to a multi-agency response to children living with domestic abuse by Ofsted, they noted the following. Our inspections found a pattern where professionals focused on the victim, which in all cases we saw was the mother. In the best case scenarios, this represented an understandable focus on the mother as a victim of crime and in need of protection. But even in the best cases, there was often a lack of accountability or responsibility attributed to the perpetrator. Furthermore, in a minority of cases, there was an inappropriate attribution of responsibility to the mother to protect her children. She's not the abuser, yet she's the one that's there supposed to protect her child. There is a really serious issue in terms of how we deal and we look at this particular issue. This heavy focus on the mother is unfortunately all too common, and although we believe that the healing process for both mother and her child needs to be done together, there is also a need for individual trauma care to overcome the impact of abuse that children experience themselves. So this is an infographic based on some of that research and work that we did that fits into the Change That Last strategy. And what we wanted to do was create a model for children and young people that hopefully brings some hope to women and children and ourselves, that collectively we can create the change needed, and that women, and the change that we know has to happen in order to improve the lives of children, women and children. And thank you. That's it.